The elegant illusion of success. Peter Marshall stood at the center of his pride and joy, an upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of the bustling city. La Finesse, as it was known to the city's elite, was more than just a dining establishment. It was a statement. Its name alone evoked images of opulence, refinement, and exclusivity. Everything in La Finesse had been carefully crafted to reflect Peter's vision of success. From the crystal chandeliers that cast a warm glow over the mahogany tables to the carefully selected vintage wines that lined the back of the bar, every element whispered luxury. Peter took pride in the fact that his restaurant attracted the wealthiest and most influential clients in the city, a testament to his meticulous dedication. But behind this grand facade of elegance, the wheels of Peter's mind were turning with unease. It had been a rough morning. Several high-profile clients had cancelled their reservations last minute, personal reasons, they claimed. To Peter, it felt like a betrayal, a slight against his establishment. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, a disturbance in the delicate harmony that was La Finesse. The morning's cancellations weren't just business. They were a personal blow to Peter, whose entire identity seemed to rest on the success of the restaurant. Every lost client chipped away at his self-worth, and today, those chips felt particularly deep. To make matters worse, the food deliveries had been delayed. Peter's prized chef, Mario, a culinary genius imported straight from the cobblestone streets of Rome, was already casting anxious glances at the empty refrigerators. The kitchen staff exchanged nervous looks, and tension hung thick in the air. Peter could feel the pressure mounting as time ticked by without any sign of the food trucks. As he paced through the restaurant, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floors, Peter's frustration grew. He was a man who thrived on control of his staff, his reputation, and most of all, his business. The restaurant was his empire, and like any emperor, Peter ruled with an iron fist. Nothing made him angrier than things falling out his carefully orchestrated control. Just as Peter felt his patience snapping, the doors to the restaurant opened, and in walked a man who, to Peter, looked out of place in his sanctuary of sophistication. The man wore simple work overalls, scuffed at the knees, with the remnants of dust and dirt clinging to his boots. His dark skin contrasted sharply against the pristine white tablecloths that adorned the dining area. To Peter, who judged people by the cut of their clothes and the weight of their wallets, the man seemed to radiate an aura of intrusion. He was a disruption in Peter's otherwise perfect day. Peter's mind was a whirlwind of irritation. This man, whoever he was, did not belong in his world of fine dining and exclusivity. Without bothering to understand who the man was or why he was there, Peter's prejudices flared to life, fueled by his already sour mood. He couldn't help but see the man as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong that morning. His day had already been derailed, and this intruder was the final straw. "What are you doing here?" Peter's voice sliced through the restaurant, dripping with disdain. The few patrons who had arrived early looked up from their menus, sensing the tension in the air. "This isn't a place for—" Peter hesitated, but only briefly. "For people like you." The man, Jonathan Carter, stood at the entrance, his face calm, his hands relaxed at his sides. There was no anger in his posture, no defiance. He had faced such hostility before. In fact, he had grown accustomed to it. Jonathan Carter was no ordinary man. As the CEO and controlling stakeholder of the largest food distribution company in the region, he was the very reason Peter's restaurant had flourished in the first place. Every delicately crafted dish that left La Finesse's kitchen was made possible by the ingredients Jonathan's company supplied. But Jonathan had never been one to flaunt his power. He preferred to operate quietly, letting his actions speak louder than his position. In that moment, Jonathan could have revealed the truth. He could have easily silenced Peter's arrogance with just a few words. But instead, he chose to remain silent. He had always believed that respect was something to be earned, not demanded, and today he would test just how deeply Peter's arrogance ran. "Excuse me," Jonathan asked calmly, his tone respectful despite the insult. Peter's eyes narrowed. He was already too far gone in his frustration to take notice of Jonathan's composed demeanor. In Peter's world, appearances were everything, and to him, Jonathan's appearance screamed unworthiness. I said, Peter began again, louder this time, "This is a restaurant for people who can afford it. You don't look like you belong here. So, unless you have some other business, I suggest you leave before I call security." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and for a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The few patrons present exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. They recognized the man standing in front of them. Jonathan Carter was known among the city's elite, though not by his face. He was the invisible hand behind the success of many high-end restaurants, including La Finlay's. Yet here he was, being humiliated by the very man whose business he had helped build. Jonathan remained quiet, his eyes never leaving Peter's. There was no anger, no indignation, just a quiet strength that seemed to unnerve those watching. He could feel the eyes of the staff on him, their discomfort evident in their averted gazes. They too knew who he was, but like many who worked under Peter's demanding rule, they feared speaking up. Peter, unaware of the growing tension around him, continued, "People come here for an experience, an atmosphere of elegance and refinement. You, quite frankly, don't fit the bill." Jonathan took a deep breath. He had learned long ago that patience and silence could often speak louder than words. This was not the first time he had been judged based on his appearance, and it certainly would not be the last. But what Peter failed to understand was that Jonathan's worth was not tied to his outward appearance. Jonathan had built an empire, just like Peter, only his was built on the foundation of respect, loyalty, and fairness, qualities that seemed foreign to Peter at this moment. Before Jonathan could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Marshall, perhaps you should listen to what he has to say." It was Mario, the head chef, who had been watching the exchange from the kitchen doorway. He had remained silent up until now, but seeing the situation spiral out of control, he could no longer stay quiet. Mario had worked with Jonathan for years, and he knew that without Jonathan's reliable supply chain, La Finlay's would not be what it was today. Peter turned sharply toward Mario, his face flushed with anger. "Stay out of this, Mario. This doesn't concern you." But it did. Mario knew that if Peter continued down this path, the restaurant's reputation would be irreparably damaged. More importantly, Peter was about to insult the very man who controlled the lifeblood of La Finlay's, its food supply. Without Jonathan, the restaurant would crumble. In the silence that followed, Peter's arrogance continued to cloud his judgment, and the stage was set for a downfall that no one in the restaurant could have anticipated. Unraveling of a false empire. As the quiet tension settled over the restaurant, Peter Marshall's sharp words echoed in the grand dining hall of La Finlay's. The chandeliers that once symbolized elegance now seemed oppressive, casting an icy glow of the growing unease among the staff and patrons. Peter, still fuming from the morning's setbacks, could not see what was coming. His pride and his arrogance had blinded him to the larger picture, and the cracks in his empire had begun to show. Jonathan Carter, standing calm and collected despite the insult, had always believed that the true measure of a man wasn't how he handled his successes, but how he responded to adversity. And Peter, in Jonathan's eyes, was failing that test miserably. Peter turned back toward Jonathan, his brow furrowed in frustration. To him, this was just another minor inconvenience in an already ruined day. But to those watching, it was much more. This was a moment that revealed the man behind the facade of wealth and power, an unmasking of sorts that exposed the shallow nature of Peter's values. "You still here?" Peter spat, his patience running thin. "I don't have time for this." Jonathan held Peter's gaze, his silence unnerving the restaurant owner further. To Peter, this was just a simple matter of dismissing someone beneath him, someone who didn't deserve his time or respect. But to Jonathan, This moment was a reflection of a larger issue, a societal flaw that ran deep in the roots of privilege, prejudice, and entitlement. Peter took a step closer, his voice rising. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but I'll have you removed if you don't leave now." It was at that moment that Jonathan decided to speak, his calm voice cutting through the rising tension. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because your food deliveries are late, and without those, your kitchen will be empty by tonight." Peter stopped in his tracks, blinking in surprise. For a brief moment, confusion flickered in his eyes. It was as if his mind couldn't quite register the words, as if he couldn't fathom how this man, this seemingly insignificant figure, could have anything to do with the lifeblood of his restaurant. "What do you mean, deliveries?" Peter snapped. "What business do you have with my suppliers?" Jonathan, still calm, replied simply, "I am your supplier." For a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The staff, the few patrons seated at their tables, and even Mario, who had watched the interaction with growing concern, all seemed to freeze. Peter's face twisted in disbelief. "What did you say?" Peter's voice was sharp, almost as if he hadn't heard correctly. Jonathan repeated himself, more firmly this time. "I am Jonathan Carter. My company supplies every ingredient you serve in this restaurant, from the freshest produce to the finest cuts of meat. Without us, your kitchen doesn't run." Peter's face paled, the weight of Jonathan's words beginning to sink in. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the image he had built of Jonathan as someone beneath him, unworthy of respect, with the reality of who Jonathan truly was, a man who held the fate of La Finesse in his hands. The silence that followed was deafening. In that instant, Peter realized the gravity of his mistake. His arrogance, his prejudice, had led him to insult the very person who was responsible for the success of his restaurant, and now that same person stood before him, watching as Peter's carefully constructed world began to unravel. The other patrons, sensing the shift in power, began to murmur among themselves. A few had recognized Jonathan's name from the city's business circles, and whispers of disbelief spread through the room. "Is that really him?" One guest whispered to another. "Jonathan Carter. He's the supplier for half the high-end restaurants in the city." Another patron, a regular at La Finesse, shook his head in disgust. "I can't believe Peter treated him that way. What's wrong with him?" The tide was turning. What had started as a private moment of condescension was quickly becoming a public spectacle, and Peter could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him, and for the first time, he felt truly vulnerable. Jonathan, however, remained composed. He had no interest in embarrassing Peter, but he wasn't going to let this moment pass without making a point. "I didn't come here to cause a scene," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "I came here to make sure your deliveries were on time, but instead, I was met with hostility." Peter swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in deeper with each passing second. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to salvage what was quickly becoming a disaster. He had spent years building La Finesse's reputation as one of the finest dining establishments in the city. He couldn't afford for that to crumble in the span of a single afternoon. But the damage had already been done. Peter took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. He was not a man accustomed to apologizing, especially not in public. But this situation called for damage control. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice strained as he struggled to maintain a polite tone. I didn't realize who you were. I apologize for the misunderstanding." Jonathan said nothing, letting Peter's hollow apology hang in the air. The patrons watched in silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. They had come to La Finesse for an experience of luxury, but what they had witnessed was something far uglier, a moment that revealed the true nature of the man behind the restaurant's success. Peter, sensing that his words were falling flat, tried again. "Please, let's not make a scene here. It's been a stressful day, and I'm sure we can put this behind us." But Jonathan wasn't interested in brushing the incident under the rug. He had spent years building his business through hard work and integrity, and he wasn't about to let Peter's arrogance go unchecked. "This isn't about a misunderstanding," Jonathan said, his voice firm but calm. "This is about respect. You judged me based on what you saw, not on who I am. And that's something that can't be fixed with an apology." Peter opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, one of the patrons stood up, their phone in hand. "I think the world needs to see this," they said, holding up their phone as they recorded the interaction. Others followed suit, pulling out their phones to capture the moment. Peter's face flushed with panic. This wasn't just a private incident anymore. This was about to go viral. He could already see the headlines. "Restaurant owner humiliates supplier in racial scandal." The thought of his reputation being torn apart on social media made his stomach churn. Jonathan, seeing the growing crowd of onlookers, turned to leave. He had no desire to drag this out any longer. But before he walked out the door, he turned back to Peter one last time. "I hope you learned something from this," he said quietly, "because next time you might not get the chance to apologize." With that, Jonathan walked out of La Finesse, leaving Peter standing alone in the middle of his once glorious empire. The weight of his actions and the consequences that would follow pressed down on him like a heavy cloud. As the door swung shut behind Jonathan, Peter felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He had always believed that his success was built on his own hard work and vision. But in that moment, he realized that success was fragile, built on relationships, respect, and trust. And with one careless act, he had shattered all of those. Outside, Jonathan got into his car, his expression unreadable. He had been through moments like this before, but each one left a scar, a reminder of the deep-rooted prejudices that still existed in the world. But Jonathan also knew that moments like these were necessary. They were wake-up calls, not just for people like Peter, but for society as a whole. As he drove away, Jonathan knew that this incident would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Peter, but for La Finesse as well. The restaurant's reputation would suffer, and Peter's arrogance would come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. For Jonathan, this was just another chapter in a long battle against prejudice and ignorance. But for Peter, it was the beginning of the end, the viral reckoning. The evening sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the city as Jonathan Carter drove away from La Finesse. The tension of the confrontation still lingered in the back of his mind, but as he navigated the familiar streets, his focus shifted to his next meeting. For Jonathan, business continued as usual. He wasn't one to dwell on personal slights. After all, he'd spent much of his life dealing with the quiet racism that permeated even the most seemingly progressive spaces. What Jonathan couldn't have anticipated, however, was just how far-reaching the consequences of that afternoon's events would be. As the door to La Finesse had swung shut behind him, the seeds of a viral scandal had been planted. The patrons who had witnessed Peter's humiliation of Jonathan had begun sharing their recordings almost immediately, and within hours, the videos spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Inside the restaurant, Peter Marshall was struggling to regain control. His staff, still stunned by the incident, moved in quiet, anxious motions. The restaurant had resumed its regular operations, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. Peter's authority, once so absolute, now seemed fragile, cracked by the weight of his own hubris. The kitchen staff, aware of the gravity of what had just occurred, whispered among themselves. They had all recognized Jonathan Carter, and the realization that their entire business relied on his goodwill was unsettling. Peter, though outwardly composed, was already battling a growing sense of dread. He knew that his actions had crossed a line, but he still clung to the hope that the incident would blow over. After all, this was not the first time he had let his temper get the better of him. But as the evening dragged on, a creeping sense of unease settled over him. He noticed that more and more of his patrons were glancing at their phones than at him, before exchanging hushed whispers. It was only when Mario, his head chef, approached him later that night, concern etched into his normally stoic face, that Peter realized just how dire the situation was. "Peter," Mario began, his voice low, "we have a problem." Peter, still in denial, frowned. "What is it? Is there an issue with the kitchen?" "No, it's not that," Mario said, shaking his head. He hesitated for a moment before pulling out his phone. "It's about what happened earlier with Mr. Carter." Peter's stomach twisted into knots. "What about it?" Mario handed him the phone, the screen already glowing with a video of the confrontation. Peter's own face stared back at him, contorted in anger as he berated Jonathan. The audio was clear, capturing every insult, every word spoken in condescension. Worse still, the video had already been shared thousands of times, and the comments beneath it were relentless. "Can you believe this guy? Racist owner insults his own supplier. Karma's coming for him. Boycott La Finesse. Jonathan Carter is a hero. Stay calm in the face of injustice." Peter's face drained of color as he scrolled through the comments, each one a hammer blow to his pride. His heart raced as the full scope of the scandal became clear. This wasn't just an embarrassing moment caught on camera. It was a viral nightmare. The video was spreading faster than he could comprehend, and with each share, his reputation was being torn apart. How many people have seen this?" Peter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mario sighed, his eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. "It's everywhere, Peter. Twitter, Instagram, even news outlets are picking it up. People are already talking about boycotting the restaurant." Peter's hands began to shake. His mind raced, desperately searching for a way to fix the situation. But there was no undoing what had been done. The internet had already passed judgment, and in the court of public opinion, Peter Marshall was guilty. "I need to fix this," Peter muttered to himself, though he wasn't sure how. He had always believed that his wealth and connections would protect him from any fallout, but this was different. This wasn't just about a few angry customers. This was a public relations disaster on a scale he had never experienced. Mario, sensing Peter's rising panic, spoke up again. "There might still be time to salvage things, but you need to act fast. Apologize publicly, reach out to Mr. Carter, and try to make amends." Peter nodded, though his mind was still clouded with fear and disbelief. Apologize. The very thought of it made his stomach churn. Peter had never been one to admit his mistakes, let alone apologize for them. But as he stared at the video replaying on Mario's phone, he knew that his hand was being forced. There was no other option. The power of a viral moment. As the night wore on, the viral video reached new heights. News outlets picked up the story, running with headlines like, "Upscale restaurant owner humiliates black supplier in racist outburst." Restaurant owner faces backlash after video of racial confrontation goes viral. Business empire shaken. The fall of La Finesse's Peter Marshall. The fallout was swift. By the following morning, Peter's phone was flooded with messages, some from old clients canceling their reservations, others from friends and colleagues expressing shock at his behavior. But the messages that hit hardest are from the restaurant's suppliers. One by one, they began to sever their ties with La Finesse. "We cannot continue doing business with your establishment given the nature of recent events," one email read. "Our company prides itself on diversity and inclusion, and we cannot in good conscience supply a business that does not share those values." Another message echoed the same sentiment. "Due to the negative press surrounding your restaurant, we have decided to terminate our contract effective immediately." Peter sat at his desk, reading the messages in stunned silence. His empire, the restaurant he had spent years building, was crumbling before his eyes. And it wasn't just the suppliers. The patrons, the very people who had once clamored for a reservation at La Finesse, were now boycotting it en masse. The viral video had struck a chord with the public. In an age where social justice movements were gaining momentum, Peter's actions were seen as a direct affront to the values that so many held dear. The The public was no longer willing to tolerate discrimination and prejudice, especially from someone in a position of power. As the day progressed, the financial impact became more apparent. Reservation cancellations flooded in, and by noon, the restaurant was practically empty. The once bustling dining room, usually filled with the chatter of the city's elite, now stood eerily quiet. Peter's phone buzzed again, and he hesitantly glanced at the screen. This time, it was a notification from a major news network. Tonight on prime time, racial confrontation at La Finesse, a special report on the viral video that shook the city. Peter's heart sank. This wasn't just a social media scandal anymore. It was becoming a national story. His name, his reputation, his business, they were all being dragged through the mud, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Desperate, Peter made a decision. He needed to apologize, publicly and as quickly as possible. Maybe, just maybe, if he acted fast enough, he could contain the damage. The apology, that wasn't enough. By the next morning, Peter had arranged a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, all eager to hear what the disgraced restaurant owner had to say. Cameras flashed as Peter stepped up to the podium, his face pale and drawn. He cleared his throat, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the sides of the podium. "I want to start by saying that I deeply regret the events that took place at La Finesse," Peter began, his voice low. "My actions were unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for them. I'll offer my sincerest apologies to Mr. Carter and to anyone who may have been affected by my words." The reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads as Peter continued, his words carefully chosen by the PR team he had hastily hired. But as the apology dragged on, something became clear. It wasn't enough. The apology, though technically correct, lacked sincerity. Peter's words felt rehearsed, forced, like a man going through the motions in a last-ditch effort to save his career. The reporters could sense it too. As the questions began, one after another, they pressed Peter for more. "Do you believe your apology is enough to make up for the harm caused?" one reporter asked. "Do you think your restaurant will survive this scandal?" asked another. Peter struggled to keep up, his responses becoming more defensive by the minute. "I've already apologized," he repeated several times, frustration creeping into his voice. "I'm doing everything I can to make amends." But the public wasn't buying it. The comments beneath the live stream of the press conference were brutal. "This guy is only apologizing because he got caught. He doesn't care about what he did. He's just trying to save his business. Too little, too late." And they were right. Peter wasn't sorry for his actions. He was sorry for the consequences. He was sorry that he had been exposed, that his empire was crumbling around him. But the damage was done, and no amount of carefully worded apologies could undo it. Jonathan's perspective. Meanwhile, Jonathan Carter had remained largely silent in the wake of the scandal. He had seen the viral video, of course, and had been inundated with messages of support from colleagues and friends. But Jonathan had never sought the spotlight, and he wasn't interested in being the face of a racial justice movement. Still, as the days passed, he couldn't ignore the impact the incident had had on the city. People were talking about racism, about prejudice, about the way people like Peter used their privilege to belittle others. Jonathan's calm demeanor in the face of Peter's outburst had resonated with people in ways he hadn't expected. Jonathan didn't want revenge. He didn't want to see Peter's restaurant destroyed, but he did want change. He wanted people to see that respect was something that should be given, not earned, and that dignity was not tied to wealth or status. As the days turned into weeks, Jonathan received countless requests for interviews, for statements, for his side of the story. But he remained quiet, preferring to let the public draw their own conclusions. In the end, it wasn't about Peter Marshall or La Finesse. It was about a larger issue, one that Jonathan had faced his entire life. And if this viral moment could shine a light on that issue, then perhaps some good could come out of it after all. The fall of La Finesse and a city awakened. Peter Marshall sat in the dim light of his office, staring blankly at the framed awards and certificates that once symbolized his success. The walls, once a testament to his accomplishments, now seemed to mock him. Each gold-plated plaque, each photo of him shaking hands with high-profile clients, felt like relics from a different life, a life that was slipping away, piece by piece. The viral video of his confrontation with Jonathan Carter had been online for nearly 2 weeks, and the fallout was worse than he could have ever imagined. His public apology had done little to quell the outrage. If anything, it had only fanned the flames, with many calling his attempt at reconciliation insincere and desperate. Social media, once a place where La Finesse had been praised for its exclusivity and fine dining, was now a battlefield of accusations, boycotts, and calls for the restaurant to be shut down. Peter's phone buzzed on the desk, but he couldn't bring himself to pick it up. He already knew what it would be, another message from a supplier or a client, cutting ties with him. Since the video went viral, one after another, La Finesse's most loyal suppliers had withdrawn their services, no longer wanting to be associated with the scandal. The restaurant's wine distributor, the artisanal cheese supplier, even the farm that provided their organic vegetables, all of them had severed their contracts, leaving La Finesse struggling to maintain its high-end menu. Worst of all, Jonathan Carter's food distribution company, which had been the backbone of La Finesse's success, had stopped all deliveries. The restaurant's refrigerators were empty, and the kitchen staff had been forced to cobble together meals from whatever ingredients they could find, a far cry from the Michelin-caliber dishes they were known for. The once bustling dining room of La Finesse was now a ghost town. On a typical evening, the restaurant would have been fully booked, with a waiting list of weeks or even months. But tonight, only 2 tables were occupied. The guests who had once paid exorbitant prices to dine in the chic, exclusive atmosphere were now hesitant to be seen there, lest they too be associated with the scandal. The quiet hum of conversation had been replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the clink of cutlery and the occasional whispered remark. Peter could feel the weight of his empire collapsing around him, but he refused to accept it. He was a self-made man after all. He had built La Finesse from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let it all slip away because of one mistake. But as the days went on, it became increasingly clear that this was not something he could control. The damage was done, and the very foundation of his restaurant, its reputation, had been shattered. A city in conversation. While Peter struggled with the unraveling of his business, the rest of the city was having an entirely different conversation. The viral video had sparked a larger discussion about race, privilege, and the way people in power treated those they perceived as beneath them. It wasn't just about Peter Marshall or La Finesse anymore. It had become a symbol of something much bigger. The city's newspapers and media outlets were flooded with opinion pieces and interviews, each one dissecting the incident and its implications. Local news programs featured debates between activists, business leaders, and community organizers about the systemic racism that had been exposed in the wake of the viral video. One headline read, "The Fall of La Finesse: How One Man's Prejudice Exposed a City's Hidden Racism." Another, more pointed, asked, "Is this the end of luxury as we know it?" Social justice groups had begun to organize protests outside La Finesse, holding signs that read "Boycott Racism" and "We Deserve Respect, Not Arrogance." Every day, a growing crowd gathered outside the restaurant, chanting slogans and demanding accountability from Peter and others like him. The protesters, a diverse group of activists, students, and community members, had turned La Finesse into a battleground for racial and social justice. The conversation had moved beyond the walls of the restaurant, igniting a broader discussion about how businesses, particularly those that catered to the city's wealthiest, often perpetuated inequality. People began questioning not just Peter's actions, but the entire culture of elitism and exclusivity that La Finesse represented. For the first time, the city's wealthiest patrons were being forced to confront their own complicity in this system. Many who had once frequented La Finesse now found themselves at odds with the idea of supporting a business that had been built on such blatant disregard for human decency. But the conversation wasn't just happening in public forums, it was happening in boardrooms, restaurants, and homes across the city. Business owners, especially those in the restaurant industry, began to take stock of how they treated their employees and customers. There were whispers of change, of creating more inclusive spaces, of diversifying their staff, and ensuring that everyone who walked through their doors was treated with dignity and respect. Jonathan's growing influence. While Peter's empire crumbled, Jonathan Carter found himself thrust into the spotlight in a way he had never anticipated. He had always preferred to operate in the background, focusing on his business and avoiding the limelight. But now, he had become a symbol of quiet strength and dignity in the face of injustice. Journalists and media outlets were clamoring for interviews with Jonathan, eager to hear his side of the story. Social media users hailed him as a hero, praising his composure during the confrontation and calling him a role model for how to handle adversity with grace. Jonathan, however, remained largely silent. He wasn't interested in being a hero or a spokesperson for any cause. To him, the incident at La Finesse had simply been another example of the discrimination he had faced his entire life. It wasn't a new story, and it wasn't one he wanted to relive over and over again in the media. But as the public's interest in the story grew, so too did the pressure on Jonathan to speak out. Leaders of the city's civil rights organizations reached out to him, asking him to lend his voice to their causes. Some even suggested that he use this moment to launch a broader movement against racial inequality in the city's business sector. At first, Jonathan resisted. He wasn't a politician or an activist. He was a businessman, and he believed in letting his work speak for itself. But as the weeks passed, Jonathan began to realize that this moment was bigger than him. The public saw something in him, a symbol of resilience, of standing tall in the face of injustice. And maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity to create real change. After much reflection, Jonathan decided to speak publicly, not to relive the events of that day, but to talk about the broader issues that the incident had exposed. He agreed to sit down for a televised interview, which would be broadcast to millions of viewers. The interview was a quiet, introspective conversation, in stark contrast to the fiery debates that had raged in the media over the past few weeks. Jonathan spoke calmly and thoughtfully, discussing the challenges he had faced as a black man in the business world, the prejudices he had encountered, and the importance of treating people with respect, regardless of their status or appearance. "I didn't want this to become a spectacle," Jonathan said during the interview. "I didn't want this to be about one man's mistake. This is about something much bigger. It's about how we see each other, how we treat each other, and how we, as a society, can do better." The interview was met with widespread acclaim. Viewers praised Jonathan for his humility and wisdom, and many called for businesses to take a hard look at their own practices in the wake of his words. Peter's desperate gamble. While Jonathan's influence grew, Peter's situation became more desperate by the day. La Finesse, once the crown jewel of the city's dining scene, was on the verge of collapse. The protests outside the restaurant had grown in size, and each day, fewer and fewer patrons dared to cross the picket line. Even those who had once been staunch supporters of Peter's business had begun to distance themselves, not wanting to be seen as endorsing his actions. Peter knew that if he didn't act soon, his restaurant would close for good. Desperation gnawed at him, and in his mind, there was only one option left. He had to make a public, personal plea to Jonathan Carter. With trembling hands, Peter wrote a letter to Jonathan, asking for a meeting. The letter was filled with regret, remorse, and a desperate hope that Jonathan would grant him the opportunity to make things right. "I know I can never undo what I've done," Peter wrote, "but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Without your support, La Finesse cannot survive, and I am asking for a chance to make amends." The letter was sent, and for days, Peter waited in agonizing silence, hoping for a response. But none came. The city, meanwhile, watched with bated breath, wondering if Jonathan would meet with the man who had wronged him so publicly. The crossroads of forgiveness and consequence. Peter Marshall's letter, laden with regret and desperation, sat on Jonathan Carter's desk, unopened for days. The weight of what it represented, Peter's downfall, Jonathan's power to influence its outcome, was something Jonathan did not take lightly. The world around him had changed so rapidly since that fateful day at La Furnaise. He had been thrust into a position of public prominence, a reluctant symbol of justice, humility, and dignity in the face of prejudice. Now the future of a man's life's work lay in his hands, and Jonathan wasn't sure what to do with it. The decision weighed heavily on his conscience. Jonathan wasn't a man who held grudges, nor was he someone who took pleasure in the downfall of others. His entire career had been built on principles of fairness, respect, and hard work. But as he stared at the letter, he couldn't ignore the reality that Peter's actions had not only been deeply personal, but also indicative of something much larger, a system of arrogance, privilege, and entitlement that had marginalized people like him for far too long. Jonathan's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from his longtime business partner, a man who had stood by Jonathan through years of hard-fought battles in the competitive world of food distribution. "Have you read it yet?" Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't told many people about the letter, but his business partner knew. He knew how difficult this decision would be for Jonathan, how the weight of public expectation was pressing down on him to either forgive or walk away. The whole city seemed to be waiting for his response, whether he would take the high road of forgiveness or allow Peter's empire to crumble under the weight of its own mistakes. He stared out the window of his office, watching the bustling city below. The skyline had changed over the years, just as Jonathan had. He had watched as new buildings sprouted up, as neighborhoods evolved, and as the very culture of the city transformed with the times. And yet, some things hadn't changed: prejudice, inequity, the quiet yet ever-present barriers for people like him. Now, Jonathan was at the center of a moment that felt like it could spark real change, not just for him, but for others who had faced similar battles. A city divided. The city, still reeling from the aftermath of the viral video, was divided on how to feel about Peter Marshall's plea for forgiveness. Public opinion, which had been so sharply focused on condemning Peter's actions, began to shift as news of the letter leaked into the press. Some saw Peter's gesture as a genuine attempt at reconciliation, a man who had been humbled by his own mistakes and was now reaching out in an attempt to make amends. Others, however, were skeptical. They saw the letter as nothing more than a calculated move, an act of desperation by a man whose empire was crumbling and who was now scrambling to save what little remained of his reputation. Social media was ablaze with debates. "Everyone deserves a second chance," one post read. "If Peter is truly sorry, then Jonathan should meet with him and help him learn from his mistakes." But another countered, "Peter only cares about his business, not about making real change. He wouldn't be apologizing if his restaurant wasn't failing. Jonathan owes him nothing." The media picked up on the public discourse, framing the situation as a moral dilemma for Jonathan. Headlines blared. "Will Jonathan Carter offer forgiveness to Peter Marshall? Redemption or ruin? The future of La Furnaise hangs in the balance." The city waited, holding its breath, as the question loomed larger with each passing day. Would Jonathan grant Peter the meeting he so desperately sought? Jonathan's decision. Jonathan didn't want to be at the center of this debate. In truth, he never sought to have any power over Peter's future. But the incident at La Furnaise had propelled him into this position, and now the city was looking to him for answers, for leadership. People he had never met had begun to see him as a symbol of resilience, someone who could stand tall in the face of injustice without compromising his integrity. But what did integrity mean in this situation? Was it about granting Peter the chance to make things right? Or was it about standing firm, refusing to absolve him of the consequences of his actions? For Jonathan, the answer wasn't simple. On the one hand, he believed in the power of forgiveness. He had seen the good it could do, not just for those seeking it, but for those granting it. Forgiveness had the potential to heal, to mend broken relationships, and to create opportunities for growth and change. But on the other hand, Jonathan knew that forgiveness couldn't be given lightly, nor could it erase the harm that had already been done. Peter's behavior at La Finesse had exposed more than just his personal prejudice. It had exposed a culture of entitlement, one that had allowed Peter to believe he could treat others, especially those he perceived as beneath him, with disdain and disrespect. Forgiveness, in this case, couldn't be just about a personal apology. It had to be about more than that. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. He thought back to the day at the restaurant, how Peter's words had cut through the air with such casual cruelty. He thought about the protests outside La Finesse, the people who had taken to the streets to demand justice, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been on the receiving end of such prejudice. The truth was, Peter's fall wasn't just about a viral video or a public scandal. It was about the dismantling of a system that had protected people like him for far too long. And while Jonathan believed in the power of forgiveness, he also believed in accountability. Finally, after days of contemplation, Jonathan made his decision. The meeting. The following week, a discreet meeting was arranged at a neutral location, an upscale hotel conference room, away from the public eye. Peter had been relieved when he received word that Jonathan had agreed to meet with him. It was his last hope, his final chance to save his restaurant from total ruin. As Peter arrived at the hotel, he was a shadow of the man he had been before the scandal. His once immaculate appearance, tailored suits, polished shoes, and an air of confidence had been replaced by a look of exhaustion. Dark circles lined his eyes, and his hair, once meticulously styled, now fell in disarray. The arrogance that had once defined him had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who was truly afraid of what the future held. When he entered the conference room, Jonathan was already seated, his posture relaxed, his expression calm but unreadable. Peter hesitated for a moment before taking a seat across from him. The silence between them stretched on, heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. "Thank you for meeting with me," Peter said finally, his voice low and shaky. Jonathan nodded but remained silent, waiting for Peter to continue. "I know I can never undo what I did," Peter said, his eyes downcast. "I've spent the last few weeks trying to come to terms with the fact that I let my own prejudices blind me. I hurt you, I disrespected you, and I acted in a way that was unforgivable." Peter paused, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them together on the table. He could feel the shame coursing through him, a deep, burning regret that had kept him awake night after night. "I've lost almost everything," Peter continued. "My business, my reputation, they're all falling apart. But more than that, I've realized that the way I treated you, how I saw you, was wrong. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you, face to face, that I'm sorry, truly sorry." For the first time since Peter had begun speaking, Jonathan's expression softened. He had been waiting for this moment, not for an apology, but for Peter to truly understand the depth of what he had done. And now, seeing the broken man in front of him, Jonathan could see that the lessons had been learned, though painfully. But Jonathan also knew that an apology alone wasn't enough. Forgiveness, if given, would have to come with conditions, ones that would ensure this kind of behavior didn't happen again, not just to him, but to anyone. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Peter's. "I appreciate your apology," he said, his voice measured. "But this isn't just about me, it's about something bigger. You're not the only one who's been hurt by this. The people who work for you, the people who look up to you, the people who come to your restaurant, they all deserve better." Peter nodded, his eyes filling with tears. He knew that Jonathan was right. This wasn't just about fixing his relationship with Jonathan. It was about making things right with everyone he had wronged, directly or indirectly. "I'm willing to work for that," Peter said, his voice breaking slightly. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Jonathan studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "I'm willing to help you rebuild," he said, "but it won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. You need to make real changes, not just in how you run your business, but in how you see the world and the people in it. Peter nodded fervently, relief washing over him like a tidal wave. "I will," he promised. "I will." Jonathan stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "I'll give you a second chance, Peter. But understand this is your last chance. Don't waste it." With that, Jonathan turned and left the room, leaving Peter standing alone, overwhelmed by the gravity of the path ahead of him. The path forward. In the days and weeks that followed, La Fenaise began the long process of rebuilding, but it was not the same restaurant it once was. Peter, with Jonathan's guidance, made sweeping changes to the way the business operated. He diversified his staff, ensuring that people from all walks of life had a place in the restaurant's operations. He implemented new training programs, teaching his employees about the importance of respect, equality, and inclusion. But most importantly, Peter worked on himself. He attended workshops, met with community leaders, and made a conscious effort to confront the biases that had once ruled his world. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were many times when Peter struggled with the weight of his past mistakes. But he was determined to prove, not just to Jonathan, but to himself, that he could change. As La Fenaise reopened, it became a different kind of restaurant, one where people of all backgrounds were welcomed, and where the lessons of humility, respect, and dignity were reflected in every aspect of its operations. Jonathan, meanwhile, continued to build his business, though now with an even greater sense of purpose. He had learned that while forgiveness could be powerful, it was accountability that truly brought about change. The city, too, changed in the wake of the scandal. Conversations about race, privilege, and fairness became more prevalent, and businesses across the city began to take stock of their own practices. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was a start, a step toward a more just and inclusive future. And as Jonathan watched the transformation of La Fenaise from a distance, he knew that real change had taken root, not just in Peter's heart, but in the heart of the city itself. Legacies forged in change. Months had passed since the fateful meeting between Peter Marshall and Jonathan Carter, and in that time, much had changed, not just for the two men at the center of the viral scandal, but for the city itself. What had begun as a moment of arrogance and prejudice in an upscale restaurant had transformed into a powerful movement, one that had rippled far beyond the walls of La Fenaise. But as the city moved forward, the question remained, how lasting would these changes be? Would the lessons learned endure, or would they fade into the background, lost among the many other headlines that filled the city's consciousness? For both Peter and Jonathan, the answer lay in how they continued to carry themselves, how they used their platforms, and how they contributed to the evolving narrative of progress and justice. La Fenaise reborn. Peter Marshall stood outside La Fenaise on a crisp autumn evening, looking up at the glowing sign that had once symbolized exclusivity and wealth. The restaurant had been completely renovated, not just in terms of its decor, but in its spirit. The changes Jonathan had urged Peter to implement were now fully realized, and La Fenaise had become something entirely new. Gone were the days of unattainable luxury and elitism. In their place stood a restaurant that prided itself on community, inclusion, and the celebration of diverse cultures and stories. The renovations were not just cosmetic. Peter had spent months working with architects and designers to transform the space into something that felt warm and inviting, a place where people from all walks of life would feel comfortable. The mahogany tables had been replaced with rustic wood, giving the space an earthy, grounded feel. Local artists, many of them from underrepresented communities, now showcased their work on the walls, turning La Fenaise into a gallery of sorts, where art and culture met in a harmonious blend. Inside, the staff was as diverse as the art that adorned the walls. Peter had made good on his promise to Jonathan, hiring people from all backgrounds, ensuring that La Fenaise was a reflection of the city's vibrant population. The kitchen, once a closed-off realm ruled by strict hierarchies, had become a place of collaboration. chefs from different culinary traditions worked together to create a menu that was as diverse as the team that crafted it. Mediterranean dishes sat alongside soul food, West African flavors blended with French techniques, and the menu told a story of cultural fusion. Peter had also taken steps to ensure that the restaurant's exclusivity was a thing of the past. While La Finesse was still a fine dining establishment, the prices were now more accessible, and a portion of the restaurant's earnings went toward funding local food programs for underserved communities. It was a small gesture, but one that reflected Peter's newfound commitment to giving back. On the night of the restaurant's grand reopening, the dining room was filled with a sense of hope and renewal. Journalists and influencers had been invited to witness the transformation, and as they entered, many were struck by how different La Finesse felt. The tension and pretension that had once defined the space were gone, replaced by an atmosphere of warmth and inclusivity. Peter stood by the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. His nerves were on edge, but there was also a sense of quiet satisfaction within him. This was the culmination of months of hard work, not just in rebuilding the restaurant, but in rebuilding himself. He had been humbled, brought to his knees by his own actions, but in that humiliation, he had found a new purpose. He no longer saw himself as the center of the universe, the king of an empire built on arrogance and entitlement. Now, he was part of something larger, a movement toward creating spaces where everyone was valued and respected. As the evening wore on, Peter found himself reflecting on the journey that had led him to this moment. He thought about the viral video that had nearly destroyed him, the protests that had erupted outside his restaurant, the sleepless nights spent worrying about his future. But he also thought about Jonathan, about the grace and dignity with which he had handled the situation, about the meeting that had changed everything. Peter knew that none of this would have been possible without Jonathan's willingness to give him a second chance. And while Peter had worked tirelessly to prove himself worthy of that chance, he also knew that forgiveness was not a one-time event. It was something that had to be earned, every day through actions and intentions. Jonathan's continuing legacy. Across the city, Jonathan Carter sat in his office, the soft hum of jazz music playing in the background. He had been keeping a close eye on La Finesse's transformation, watching as Peter slowly but surely rebuilt the restaurant from the ground up. Jonathan had chosen not to attend the grand reopening, preferring to remain in the background. His role in the story of La Finesse was well known, and he didn't feel a need to be in the spotlight. Besides, he had work of his own to focus on. In the months since the scandal, Jonathan's company had grown exponentially. The viral video had brought him unexpected attention, and while he had never sought fame, the exposure had opened doors for him that had once been closed. Major restaurant chains, hotels, and even international markets had reached out to him, eager to do business with the man who had stood firm in the face of injustice. But Jonathan wasn't interested in simply growing his business for the sake of profit. He had always believed in using his success to uplift others, and now, with this newfound influence, he saw an opportunity to do just that. He had begun investing in small, local food businesses run by people from marginalized communities, offering them the support and resources they needed to thrive in an industry that often shut them out. He had also started a mentorship program, working with young entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds who wanted to break into the food industry. Jonathan knew how hard it was to succeed in a world that often judged people based on their appearance or background, and he wanted to create pathways for others to follow in his footsteps. The program had been a huge success. Every week, Jonathan met with aspiring chefs, restaurant owners, and food suppliers, offering them advice, connections, and encouragement. For many of them, Jonathan was more than just a mentor. He was a symbol of what was possible, a reminder that success didn't have to come at the expense of one's integrity. One afternoon, as Jonathan sat in a meeting with a young chef who had just opened her first restaurant, his assistant knocked on the door, holding a thick envelope. "This just arrived for you," she said, handing it over. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the formal packaging. He opened it carefully, pulling out a handwritten letter. As he began to read, he realized it was from Peter Marshall. Peter's letter. The letter was not long, but it was heartfelt. Peter had written to express his gratitude for the second chance Jonathan had given him. He wrote about how much his life had changed since that day at La Finesse, how the experience had forced him to confront parts of himself that he had long ignored. "I know that I don't deserve your forgiveness," Peter wrote, "but I want you to know that I am trying, every day, to be the kind of person who does. Your guidance, your patience, and your grace have changed my life. La Finesse is not just a restaurant anymore, it's a reflection of the lessons I've learned, and for that I will always be grateful." As Jonathan read the letter, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. He had never needed Peter's gratitude, but it was clear that the man had changed. And while forgiveness had been difficult, Jonathan knew that it had been the right choice. By offering Peter a second chance, he had not only helped transform a single restaurant, he had sparked a conversation that had reverberated throughout the entire city. A city changed. The transformation of La Finesse was emblematic of a broader shift happening in the city. In the wake of the viral scandal, many other businesses had taken a hard look at their own practices, questioning whether they, too, were perpetuating systems of inequality and exclusion. Some had followed in Peter's footsteps, making changes to diversify their staffs and ensure that their workplaces were inclusive. Others had started initiatives to support local communities, offering scholarships, job training, and mentorship programs for people from underserved backgrounds. The protests that had once taken place outside La Finesse had not faded away, but they had evolved. The movement that had been sparked by Peter's actions had grown into something larger, a citywide push for justice, equality, and opportunity for all. Activists continued to hold leaders accountable, ensuring that the changes being made were not just surface level, but deeply ingrained in the fabric of the city's businesses and institutions. For many, the story of La Finesse had become a symbol of what was possible when people were willing to confront their own biases and work toward creating spaces where everyone was valued. The city, once divided by lines of privilege and exclusion, was slowly but surely becoming a place where diversity was celebrated, not just tolerated. The legacy of Jonathan and Peter. As time went on, both Jonathan and Peter found themselves reflecting on the legacies they were leaving behind. For Jonathan, the path forward was clear. He would continue to build his business, using his success to uplift others and create opportunities for those who had been shut out of the industry. His mentorship program would grow, and he would continue to invest in small businesses, ensuring that the next generation of entrepreneurs had the support they needed to succeed. Peter's path was more complicated. While he had made significant changes at La Finesse, he knew that the road to redemption was a long one. He couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but he could work every day to be better. His restaurant had become a beacon of hope, a place where people from all walks of life could come together to share a meal, tell their stories, and celebrate their cultures. And for Peter, that was enough. The city, too, had changed. The conversation that had begun with a viral video had grown into a movement, one that would continue to shake the city for years to come. It was a reminder that even the smallest moments of prejudice and injustice could spark something much larger, a movement toward a more just and inclusive society. And as Jonathan and Peter moved forward, their legacies intertwined, they knew that the journey toward change was far from over. But they also knew that they had played their part, and that, in the end, their story was one of transformation, redemption, and the power of second chances.